Thank you, Claudia, for that fantastic introduction. I'm very grateful to be here, and I'm honored to be among esteemed colleagues and dear friends, and very pleased to tell you about our work today. This is a very exciting meeting. It's a topic that's very close to my heart and to my studies in the last decade and more. And what I'm thrilled about today is also that we have such an interdisciplinary group here that comes with challenges and opportunities. And the challenge is kind of to pitch the level of description at the right granularity. So I've tried to do that to my best, and we can discuss, particularly I've kept the talk light on the weeds of the methods and trying to give you the results and the interpretation and the thinking around this work. So nearly everyone who's held an infant in their arms has wondered what it is like to be a baby. And this is now seemingly pervasive curiosity and preoccupation among scientists and the lay public hasn't always been so, and even as close as the 1980s. Infants were operated upon without anesthesia on the assumption from the medical profession that there wasn't really anything going on inside and that there was no inner life. So it's fair to say that there is a rapid evolution of our understanding and a really curiosity about understanding the infant mind. And it's a very exciting time, and it is fair to say that this area is probably one of the great frontiers of consciousness science. So there is disagreement with regards to when consciousness starts, what's the onset of consciousness in human development. And led by Tim Bain and Joel Froehlich, we reviewed the literature to understand the state of the art of where the researchers are placed in this disagreement. And there are two broad camps, one that is quite happy to think about an early onset around birth or even in the last few weeks of pregnancy, and a late onset camp that really for whom the presence of consciousness hinges on more higher level, the presence of higher level cognitive faculties such as decision making, reflection, introspection, and then in that case we're looking at the end of the first or second year of life before we can say that consciousness is present. So because infants cannot tell us themselves what they think or feel, it's very challenging methodologically and from a lay perspective to really to unravel what their consciousness might be like. But as far as my perspective is concerned, I take inspiration from my long work in the area of other populations that are behavior non-responsive, the lack willful behaviors, such as individuals who become severely brain injured after severely brain injured and then become behavior non-responsive, and in some cases harbor covert consciousness. So we have to really develop neuroimaging methods to really understand what's going on with their level of awareness. And also with reversibly abolishing consciousness under deep anesthesia, we have learned a lot about neural correlates of consciousness and more broadly features of the functional neuroarchitecture that supports consciousness in the adult brain. So I'm not going to review that literature, but I'm taking the assumption that that is something we can discuss later, that a lot of you will know about. In the clinical context, consciousness is assessed by looking at two dimensions. So this is for populations for whom consciousness status is in question. Arousal and awareness in all of us, these two dimensions are alive and well. Arousal refers to our ability to open eyes, to have sleep-wake cycles, and awareness is assessed by the individual's ability to follow commands, in particular, like at the bedside. The doctor might ask for the individual to raise their hand or to track something in their visual field. There are very particular protocols around this, but this is the gold standard for the clinical science. And of course, verbal report is really important for determining awareness. Now, in the infant, these tools for awareness are not available of course, infants have arousal, they open their eyes, they appear to be asleep, they wake up and so on, but awareness is really challenging to determine objectively. And so this is where I think the challenge starts. And the profound limitations of the newborn infant, the behavioral limitations, then make it difficult to ascertain consciousness. And the approach that I take to making progress in this area is to actually look at whether the neonate brain has the capacity or the neural architecture, the way that we know the brain is organized from adult studies, to support conscious awareness. And this is what I'll be talking about today. Importantly, this is where neuroimaging comes into play, and it's such a wonderful tool for providing a window into the minds and the brains and the minds of the neonates, and much as we have learned from brain-injured individuals. And traditionally, it's been difficult to scan neonates because they are wriggly, but technological developments are really enabling a new era of advances. And here's some pictures from the Human Developing Connectome project at King's College London, which is leading the way in and acquiring the largest MRI cohort of infant neuroimaging. In some cases, infants need to be swaddled to stay still in the scanner, but it works. And we are starting to learn a lot about the infant brain, but a lot still remains to be understood. So for example, we know that the third trimester of pregnancy from 28 weeks onwards is really important for the development of the brain, such as the cortical folding developing at this time, and also axonal connectivity and neurogenesis is completing in the perinatal period. So this is a time when the brain grows faster than all the other periods. And so what's really nice about this cohort is that we have a large amount of data. We have high temporal and spatial resolution of the fMRI image, and we have 282 neonates that are born at full term. And then we have 73 neonates that are born preterm and scanned at term equivalent age. So this is a really important comparison when we're looking at the effect of prematurity for clinical manifestations or clinical implications, because the infants are at the same age. Another critical comparison here is that of infants that are born prematurely and scanned before term equivalent age of 37 weeks, because this allows us to have a natural modulation of infant age in this group. And if you're looking to place the onset of consciousness in time, then it's really important to have this younger group of infants. We also have 176 adults who are from the Human Connectome project. And so here I will discuss 3 studies that deal with features of the neural architecture, the way that the brain is organized in the adult, that we have learned over many, many studies appear to support consciousness. So again, trying to take a stab at where people's understanding is with regards to functional organization. Most of you probably know that the brain is organized in functional networks shown by this different colors, and functional networks are parts of the brain that work together to achieve specific functions. And they're not exclusively involved in any function or the other, but they primarily carry out certain tasks and they work in tandem with one another. Importantly, we have learned that 2 types of brain networks, the default mode network, shown here in red in the middle of the brain, and the frontoparietal networks, which are 2 networks, dose attention and executive control networks that are laterally on the brain, show a reciprocal relationship shown by these colors that are antipose, so hot versus cold, then they switch. But primarily, the idea is that this is one of the most replicated relationships in cognitive neuroscience, that one of the network is up and working hard, such as the default mode network. The other networks, the frontoparietal networks, are suppressed, and they work in tandem in this antipose manner. And this has also been shown to be abolished with various state manipulations of consciousness. So it appears to be a robust neurocorrelate of consciousness. And I'll tell you more about this in a minute, but this is the first relationship that I wanted to look at. Then we are also looking at the functional small world architecture. What does this mean? So this is basically another well-established principle that the brain is organized in a small world fashion, which supports the differentiation and the integration balance of conscious experience. What this means is that connections in local parts of the brain are more dense between the networks, and across more distant parts of the brain, connections are sparser to enable efficient integration of those differentiated and very specific representation. So that is very briefly an introduction on the small world architecture, which is also very important and well replicated in terms of its modulation by consciousness state manipulations. But a functional small world architecture captures a more static quality of the healthy brain organization. And we know that the brain is not static at all, and that in fact, the dynamic evolution of the balance between segregated and integrated types of representations has been 25 years ago now postulated to be a generic feature of consciousness. And this is the complexity of the brain signal. The idea that the more complex the signal of the brain, the more able it is to support conscious experience. And Tononi and Enderman were the first to suggest this, and this principle of complexity then became the foundation of the integrated information theory. And complexity has been used as a proxy for consciousness. It scales down with consciousness in disorders of consciousness with states that are behaviorally less aware, appear to be less aware, such as minimally conscious or unresponsive well-connected states. Complexity scales down. So it's also a very good measure to look at. I ran 3 studies in my group to look at these 3 features. And I want to stress here that we are looking at the capacity, understand this to be the capacity, like the infrastructure that is enabling the conscious thoughts, not the content of conscious awareness. And the first study was published 3 years ago now. And at that time, we knew even less than we know now. And basically, I have described the 2 frontoparietal networks, dorsal attention, executive control. They are primarily very responsive to attention to external stimuli and goal-driven behavior in broad strokes. And the default mode network, again, in broad strokes, is very involved in self-referential thinking, self-awareness, introspection, autobiographical memory. And they express this relationship that when the frontoparietal networks shown here in pink and green are up, the default mode is down, and vice versa. So this is a very regulated relationship. When we started this study, even the idea that high-order networks, such as the one I described, are actually present in the infant brain was controversial. Maybe there's 2 or 3 more studies now that agree with our study, but the majority of the studies up to this point suggest that these high-order networks are developing in the brain by the end of the first year and onward. So that was the first gap that we wanted to address with this large cohort of infant neuroimaging that I mentioned. And also, this antipose relationship had not been investigated. So that is what we asked. And of course, we want to know what the effects of premature birth are from the perspective of early neonate age, those infants who aren't yet at term equivalent age, but also from the perspective of clinical implications, what is the impact of premature birth? So here are some connectivity matrices looking at network connectivity. So I'm going to guide you through these in a simplistic way. So we have these pixels, the small boxes represent connectivity amongst the different regions of interest that are part of each network, which I haven't represented for simplicity. But importantly, red means strong connectivity and blue means low connectivity. And the squares around the center diagonal here represent the connectivity of each of those networks. So in green, DMN, in blue, DAN, and ECN in red. So the more red those colors are in those squares, the stronger within network connectivity, the more distinct the identity of that network, the more interconnected those regions are among themselves. DAN is, oh my God. DAN is dorsal attention network, and ECN is executive control network, and they're both part of the frontoparietal extents. Thank you for the question. And this is the adults, and this kind of sets the template for how this connectivity looks. This is our baseline with very strong connectivity between the networks, and in blue, weaker connectivity between the networks. So the DAM and DAN connectivity is represented here. And so what we're looking for in the first instance is whether these networks are present at birth. In other words, do they have this distinct identity? And you can see that, let's say, from adults to full-term birth, we see a sort of a washing out of this connectivity pattern, but still within those squares, you can see a red, connectivity, strong connectivity, even though it's more patchy. And as we go, as we go towards infants before term equivalent age, we can see that that sort of structure we can even visually inspect is being diluted. And at a more higher level, I think a more easy way to represent this term equivalent age. Term equivalent age, so that is infants that may be born at 26 weeks. As they grow, by the time they reach 37 weeks, they are said to reach term equivalent age. So term equivalent age is basically close to full-term born. It's a healthy period for an infant to be born. And another way of looking at this that might be easier, so I will invite you to first look at the bottom panel. Oh, God, what am I doing? Here, at the bottom panel with the 3 color-coded executive control network nodes, dorsal attention nodes, and default mode network nodes. So this is multidimensional scaling, which allows us to portray the connectivity profile of different regions in a multidimensional way. And basically, the regions that are close together are showing a connectivity profile that's similar to one another. And so the components, if you were, of the executive control network are close to one another. That's showing the distinct identity of this network. And the DAN also has a distinct identity, so does the DMN in the adult brain. And this is, we're looking for this in the 3 infant groups. So if we go across to the right, then we can see that these regions, these components of each network are coming closer together. They're less differentiable, but still statistically, you can differentiate these clusters from one another. So this statistically tells us that at full-term birth, the 3 networks are distinct from one another, and therefore we say they are present based on our definition. And as we move towards before term equivalent age, statistically, we really cannot differentiate these networks from one another. They are overlapping. And their relationship is still, their identity is present, but weaker at infants that were born premature and have now grown to reach term equivalent age. So what this is telling us is that these networks are present by full-term birth, and when infants reach term equivalent age, they are developing from in preterm infants up to term equivalent age according to a pre-programmed developmental trajectory. They are weaker, so we can still see the effect of prematurity as preterms reach term equivalent age, but they are there. So that is the first finding. The second finding is looking at this, what I've defined the anti-post relationship between these networks. And in yellow now, I have highlighted the connectivity between the networks. So I think these are a little bit counterintuitive or maybe not so intuitive to look at, but if you just go with the explanation that the area we're looking at here is representing the connectivity between the default mode network and the dorsal attention network. And it is in blue, and that is a representation of this low connectivity. These networks are not active at the same time, so they have low connectivity. In some cases, they might be anti-correlated. And this is what I'm referring to as statistically as this anti-post relationship. And this area is representing connectivity between the dorsal attention network and the executive control network, and it is warmer in color. These frontoparietal networks typically function as a pair in their own function, and that's why they're more strongly connected. So if we look at the adults then, our definition for the antipoles relationship statistically here is that the connectivity between the default mode and the dorsal attention network is low, is significantly lower than between the frontoparietal networks amongst themselves. And this is what we see in adults. This is sort of our baseline. And then if we go across to the infant groups, we see that this relationship is present statistically in the full-term born infants and infants at term equivalent age, but not in infants who are younger, so they're before term equivalent age. So this is a very brief summary of the findings from the first study. And this is an illustrative representation of what I've just shown. We have these three networks and their relationship, and we have these four groups, three infant groups. So at term equivalent age, all these networks have been shown to be present, including their relationship. The dorsal attention network starts even before term equivalent age, but not the other two. And they are in a protoform. Obviously, they are developing. They are not as robust as when individuals are adults, but that doesn't matter for our purposes. What we have shown here is that the frontoparietal networks, the default mode, and their relationship are present by term equivalent age. So these are key networks of the brain, and they're very important for supporting cognitive function and consciousness. So this also shows that the third trimester is critical because the infants that are young before they reach this term equivalent age of the end of the third trimester of development don't have these features. So we need that time. The brain needs that time to develop these features. Some prematurity-related disruption persists, and overall, having this feature of these networks present in the brain supports an early onset view. In the second study, we looked at the development of small world architecture, and as you are well aware, conscious awareness or consciousness has the qualities of differentiation. So any experience that you can think about will have a very vivid specific feature: sight, smell, sound, touch. But that while we can hold these in mind individually, they are also part of an integrated conscious experience, much like being immersed in a street in New York. And it is thought that the small world architecture of the brain, through its dense connections within networks that support specialized representations and sparse connections across the brain that supports the integration of representations, is facilitating these qualities of conscious experience. And up to this point, we didn't really know whether infants have this small world architecture organization and whether what's the effect of early neonate age and prematurity. So that is what we studied in the second study. And here I have three panels. And for the purpose of this, I guess the key point to point out is that we have a measure of small worldness that is basically the balance of integration and segregation, but we can also measure the extent of segregation and integration on their own. And the goodness or the fitness of each of these goes in slightly different directions, in opposite directions, so don't worry about that. The main takeaway from this is that relative to adults, which are in blue, all the three infant groups, full-term, preterm at term equivalent age, or preterm before term equivalent age, all of these three groups have a lower small worldness and lower segregation and lower integration than adults. So that this is sanitary as it should be. And what another thing that we did is actually use a more cruder summary measure of small world organization that is a very well accepted measure. And that is a threshold measure that we performed according to different methods to validate. And this is the 0.6 value that has been postulated that is a threshold for the presence of small worldness. And what we found was surprising, that was that with these threshold measures, we can see that over 70% of infants born before term equivalent age have some version of small word organization. So I'd say it's a proto small word organization. But it was surprising to us that even at this young age, that this small word organization has begun to play out. And of course, full-term born infants have a big jump. So over 97% of them have small word based on this threshold measure. So that is the first finding, that the takeaway is that actually small word organization is present in the majority of neonates. We can also look at premature birth and neonate age individually or on their own. The effect of premature birth is comparing the two, the full-term born and infants that are term equivalent age, so the same age, and the neonate age is basically comparing younger infants to the full-term born. And so when we look at the effect of prematurity, there is lower network segregation in preterm infants at term equivalent age. So prematurity still has an effect by the time infants reach full-term birth. And neonate age, so the younger infants relative to the older infants, have more pronounced disruptions of their small wordness, so small world network integration and small wordness overall. So this is telling us that the differences exist, that small wordness is developing as infants move through that third trimester. Now, small wordness is a global measure of how the world is, the whole brain rather, is organized. And we wanted to look at more functionally specific regions to see whether there are some regions that develop faster versus slower in this period with regards to small wordness. And when we look at that effect of prematurity, so the infants at the same age, we see a few significant differences that are there, but they're not massive. When we compare infants before term equivalent age and infants that are at full-term birth, we can see that out of the 11 networks that were investigated, 9 show disruptions or massive, rather undergo massive development in this third trimester. So they are disrupted before term equivalent age. And if we look at what these networks are, we might glean some information about the kinds of functional relevance of the development in question. We expected, based on my first study, that the higher order networks are the ones that are showing the most rapid development in the third trimester because, amongst other things, the infant mind is developing and is trying to get the capacity to grapple with the world. But actually, when we order the effect of the networks, what we see is that the highest proportion of growth happens in the somatomotor network. They're mentioned here as mouth versus hand, based on their areas that are being represented in the somatomotor network. And that this growth in the somatomotor network trumps, so is more widespread than in the higher order networks, adult potential, singular opercular frontoparietal control network. So this was really interesting and surprising. And in fact, how do we interpret this? This is in agreement with recent thinking around the role of embodied cognition, and a recent review by Anna Cernica. I'm sorry, I probably don't pronounce your name correctly. Pointed out that infants, in addition to being prepared for movement, that the role of the somatomotor networks in the brain actually is subserving, is facilitating the early development of the individual's core functions of awareness, including physical boundaries, position, facial, visceral states, all types of developments and capacities that the infant must, that can be a priority of the third trimester of development. And our data supports this idea that this is one in view that explains why the somatomotor network appears to be a key priority of development in the third trimester. And it suggests that in addition to movement, that capacity, the genesis and the evolution of the capacity of the organism to understand its own place and its interrelationship with the world is really a priority of development in the early period before birth and around birth. So the interim of the study, too, is that we have in blue the adults, and then we have the 3 infant groups that show lesser than adult levels of small awareness, but they all have it. So that's a check mark. They have some version of it. And that the younger neonates before they reach terminal age show this massive explosion of development, particularly somatomotor in higher order networks. And there is significant premature related differences that remain up to terminal age. But that is really to be seen what's the functional relevance of that is as the individual develops after the full-term birth. So then the third study that I wanted to touch upon really briefly is the development of neurocomplexity in the newborn infant. And you're probably all familiar with the concept of complexity, of brain complexity, and that in some theories, 3 minutes, okay, is essential for consciousness. It has some essential role for conscious awareness. In disorders of consciousness, we have seen many times that complexity measured by entropy is decreased as consciousness level is decreased. So that is what we expect. It might be the case in infants. If you come from a view that infants are sort of a diminished version of an adult in their capacity for awareness. But there is also the entropic brain hypothesis that is proposed by Cathcart Harris in 2014. And this suggests that actually entropy and consciousness don't have a linear relationship, but that there is an inverted curve relationship that means that there is a critical level at the top of the inverted U curve where normal consciousness is could be located. And then on one hand, we have highly reduced entropy in states of loss of consciousness, such as coma, anesthesia, deep sleep. These are ordered states with very low flexibility in the repertoire of changes that can happen. But there's another end to this continuum, and this is the over-entropic continuum, where it's occupied by things such as psychedelic states, dreaming, and so on, that are states of high entropy, disordered thinking, perhaps, and high flexibility in the types of states that the brain can inhabit. So this is important in terms of us trying to figure out where do infants fit in this picture. And this is what we were trying to ascertain. And again, I have 3 measures here that I have mentioned before. And we have adults and the 3 neonate groups. So the first thing to take home from this slide that is, again, complicated is that relative to adults in blue, all the 3 infants groups have an over-entropic state. So they don't exhibit lower entropy than adults, but they have higher entropy than adults. So infants, in our hands, come up here at the higher entropy end of the spectrum. And so we can also look at where each infant group fits with regards to its entropy relative to full-term neonates. And what we see is that, again, preterm infants are over-entropic relative to full-term born infants. So this is starting to look like a consistent picture. So instead of these groups being in this end, scaling up with, with age and prematurity, they are scaling up in this other way. So it seems that consciousness, or rather capacity, is reducing in complexity. And when we compare the 2 infant groups together, before term that are premature, but one is young and one is late, we see that preterms before term, so the younger infants are even more entropic relative to the full-term born. And we can also look at the relationship with age in the preterms that are premature, and we see a negative relationship with the age in this young, narrow age group. So again, this is telling us that entropy decreases with a young infant age in the 3rd trimester of development, and that full-term borns have higher entropy than adults. So on one hand, this is surprising. It's not what I would have expected based on my work with disorders of consciousness. But so how do we interpret this? With regards to the full-term born, this maybe is interpretable, and this is not yet published, so I ask that these results are not shared widely, just because they are in the process of being published, and the journal asks us that. But so the overentropic state in full-term borns in particular might be fitting with Alison Gopnik's idea, proposal of a lantern of consciousness in infants, and suggesting that unlike a spotlight of attention, there is a broader casting of less focused attention in infancy. And what we might be seeing here is that overentropic state being the neural underpinning of this highly exploratory state in which infants are meant to be exhibiting as part of their development. So that is on one hand, but on the other hand, I'm not quite sure how that fits with the fact that preterms before term equivalent age have even higher entropy. So in that case, it might be that actually being in an overentropic state is not really conducive to stable representations. It's hard to know based on this data, but I do find this result intriguing. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go over. Okay. Thank you. So basically, this is the results overall that we have this from the parietal default mode networks and their relationship in study 1 and 2. The X here is that we did not find these networks in preterm infants before term equivalent age, but we did find some version of small awareness. So things are not as developed in young infants before 37 weeks, but the evidence is patchy. On the other hand, with entropy, we found that all the three infant groups are overentropic relative to adults, and that entropy actually scales up with younger infant groups. So I think this is really intriguing, and that's why I place the question mark here, because I am still trying to figure out what the functional relevance of this finding is. But let's just bring this back to, I started with this idea that it's possible to understand the capacity or the neural architecture for conscious awareness in infants. So what are we learning? So how can we put this in the context of what we know about neural markers, particularly from adults? What does this all mean? I suppose my last point here is that we need to be cautious and that there is a trade-off between the sensitivity and the specificity of the markers. And when we're not talking about behavior, we have to really assess what it is that we are learning. So when we are looking at healthy adults, command following and verbal report are highly specific markers of awareness, and particularly they mark agency. So that is very clear. And each marker has very high confidence. They are highly specific, but they can also be low in sensitivity because there are situations where healthy adults don't exhibit these behaviors. So then if we're looking at chronic brain injury and even more impaired individuals, then we can have other markers such as willful modulation of brain activity, in the absence of the behavior, can be said to be a mark of agency. Then we can go to states where arousal fluctuates. So they're not really able to pay attention to instructions, and they're not able to consistently follow commands with their brains. And here is where work that I haven't mentioned has looked at naturalistic movies to capture attention over time. And that is a more sensitive marker because not impaired by awareness, but is, again, here we're moving towards less specificity, but more sensitivity. When we're then looking at infants, I've presented several potential markers, and there's others that I haven't mentioned that we reviewed with Tim and Joel, including our prediction multisensory integration. So we have now, I think, a cluster of markers that if overall they point in the right direction, even individually they're not as specific, they are more sensitive, and overall they increase confidence together that we are looking at something more solid with regards to the internal life or the capacity for internal life. So in summary, some features of brain architecture are present by full-term birth or term equivalent age, but not before. The third trimester of infant development is critical, I think, for the preterm neuroarchitecture. These results support the infant view with regard, the early onset view with regards to the capacity for awareness. We do find evidence for non-linear changes in perinatal complexity. And intriguingly, these results suggest that experience is different from that of adults in infants, and this has challenges and opportunities. In terms of future directions, we want to see longitudinal data so that the same infants can be followed over time, and we can see after birth what is the relevance of these markers for the incipient behaviors that are coming online. The cluster approach is needed. And more importantly, we want to actually try and understand what it is like to be an infant. That is what we're trying to get at. And together with our results showing that there is higher complexity and the suggestion that potentially infant experience is different from that of adults, we also have evidence from older infants, like up to 9 months or before, of this concept of perceptual narrowing, where the infant's broader capacity than adults to discriminate faces of the same, of a different race from ours, or different ethnic groups, or to discriminate non-native phonemes in a way that adults can't. This capacity for this broader discrimination narrows around the age of 9 months. So there is something different going on there with adults relative to infants. And also infants, some studies have shown, seem to have a different sense of time in terms of chunking of events in a naturalistic stream in longer events as opposed to shorter events compared to adults. So this is something really that is going to become, I think, the next really exciting ground to try and understand what these measures are telling us about the experience of infants. And the way to really make progress in this direction is to look at awake infant neuroimaging as they are engaging with complex stimulation, such as those that I have worked on in behavioral non-responsive groups. Particularly movies are very, very engaging for infants. So this is a 2-month-old who's paying attention to a movie being shown in the scanner from the work of one of my colleagues, showing that really there is a high success rate of scanning infants, and that is where we need to go. So thank you so much for your attention.
Yeah, it was a fantastic talk. So it's common in thinking about consciousness in adults to distinguish between consciousness and attention. But as far as I could tell, all three of your measures really didn't distinguish between them. You did mention in the discussion of the Gopnik thing that maybe you might think of infants as having a less control over attention, maybe no top-down attention, with maybe more or less equivalent amount of awareness. But anyway, I'm just wondering how the distinction figures in your thinking.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And there's very complex topic. So on the one hand, when we're looking at markers in the absence of stimuli, we really can't look at attention. So that is one limitation. And then when we're looking at neuroimaging and the capturing of brain activity according to regimented protocol that are stimuli-based, then we often are looking at the engagement of attention and be using attention as a way to trace the development of the thought. So a lot of the neuroimaging-based measures of conscious awareness, particularly around stimuli response, agency, command following, those kinds of more specific markers of awareness that I have discussed, really I rely on the capturing of attention to help us interpret what's happening in the mind. So I would say generally in my work, I haven't made a strong distinction between the capturing of attention in a conscious task-related thought process and consciousness, but I know that there are areas where those two dissociate, and it's possible to study with other means. And yeah, so with attention and the ability to really engage with the information processing in a direct cognitive way, that is what I was referring to, the work of Alison Gopnik. And I think Alison is in the audience, so she can help me out as needed later as well. But yeah, I think that's where the boundaries between the two become more fuzzy. And also, I think when we don't have attention as a guiding kind of light in cognitive neuroscience, it's harder than to interpret what's happening in consciousness in states where we don't have behavioral reports. So I don't know if I'm answering you precisely, but it's a good point and it's a complex one.
Thank you so much. I'm here.
Oh,
hi. Thank you so much for an amazing talk. I really learned a lot. So I have two questions. The one is about how do you define consciousness? So what do you mean? So so what's your operational definition of consciousness? Conscious awareness. And the second one is more methodological. So let me try if I use a metaphor. So suppose I'm climbing a mountain. Yeah. The skills I need to the first steps are not necessarily those I need to the last steps. Yeah. But then the question is, if you take as a reference point the adult, organization, your organization, work down to the first steps. I wonder if this is it's like the good approach, because after all, what you need at the first step is not necessarily what you need at the last step. Yeah. So it's like minimal doesn't mean less. It means that you need the skills that you need at that particular step. Because otherwise it'll be like, so then the methodological question would be, is it really useful to take as reference point the last, the mountain climbing as a reference point for consciousness at the very early on? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so those are very good questions, and I think the beauty of being an interdisciplinary group is that we all need to think about those are more comments. I would say they're not necessary. I give you my view, but they're not points that have a worked out answer, because consciousness, particularly in groups that don't tell us for themselves, doesn't have very well worked out answer. So in the first instance, the first question is, each of us here might have a slightly different definition, more well-developed definitions. For the purpose of my talk, I look at consciousness as the capacity to have an experience, a subjective point of view. So it's very broad. And apart from the studies that are looking at stimulus response, I'm not really going so much into the definition of consciousness from an operational perspective. So I'm looking at the capacities, and that builds on previous work. But that's not very controversial. Second, it's a very good point that what we are looking at in adults, and I alluded that at the end to that, might be very different to what we're looking at in infants, and that's very, very exciting. So, for example, preterm infants before term equivalent age are rather young. Here, the group is between 32 and 35 weeks, so not too young. They still have corticothalamic connections. They still have the substrate that enables conscious awareness in the brain. If we see that consciousness is enabled by the brain, which is the view that I take. So it is not unfeasible, even though some of my results suggested that these infants are not as capable for conscious, don't have the capacity as developed as the older infants, but they have a higher complexity. So it might be possible that there is an in-between ground where the way that the brain develops is that it needs to have very inchoate types of experiences at this age that we cannot really relate to the experiences of adults, that I'm not quite sure what they would be like phenomenologically, but they are nevertheless part of that conscious experience. They are part of a complex brain that is creating representations. They might be very fragmented representation. They might be part of the low frequency of the spectrum, and there might be features of those representations are very different from what we typically experience. So it's really hard to imagine what they are. But instead of saying, well, those at that age, infants don't have the capacity and they have overentropic brains and they can't represent anything, it's possible that they are representing things in the most efficient way that is related to consciousness in a genuine way, but it's hard to really postulate. So the point that I'm trying to make is that we really need to work together to forward this, to break new ground in the way we understand consciousness in these boundary conditions, because it's not at all clear. And I think we stand to learn a lot if we work together and we come at it from different perspectives.
Hi, This is completely fascinating, and I love the way in which like you're also tying like agency to consciousness. I was wondering if you could just really briefly go to the slide where you're showing the finding with the mouth and hand, actually related to some of Anna's work, because I don't know if I quite caught that, and it might just. And so this finding in particular, so you're finding very high centrality for mouth and hand areas.
Yes, so we are finding that these areas are the ones that have a lot of regions developing efficient communication, according to our measure, between before term equivalent age, so younger infants, versus by the time they reach term equivalent age. These are the areas that develop the most in that measure of regional efficiency of communication. So it's a measure of development of these networks.
So that's like fascinating, and maybe give some support for some like a mad dog embodiment perspective that I've been putting forward and trying to combine different theories, like both like global workspace and integrated information theory, but saying basically that like body embodiment and body maps and things like affordance competition are at the core of things, and like even like so like in terms of like early infant consciousness, like something like motor babbling and cognitive motor babbling. And then from there, like selecting like what works. And then this being basically like part of a bootstrapping process of increasing coherence. And so it would make potentially some sense with some, with hands waving, that like the hand and the mouth, thinking of like the infant's life world and what it's doing, what's most central to it, like nursing. And it's like that basically would be like the inner kernel from which you might bootstrap the rest, and that would have high centrality. And that this would potentially basically entangle agency and consciousness in interesting ways. Thank you.
I agree. Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, William Graff from Connecticut. Wonderful presentation, Lorina. Really very, very interesting, your research. My question, I think you just answered the question, but I was interested in that less than TEA group, that term equivalent age group. You were saying that's 32 to 35 weeks. And I understand for research analysis, you need to lump into a group, recognizing that there's a huge difference between 32 and 35 or 36 weeks. But in doing your research analysis, how do you reconcile that lumping when you know that the changes are so dramatic from week to week?
It's a good question, and I think it's an area that we need to, again, it requires more research, and it will improve as we develop. I think looking at correlations with age, so that's one of the graphs that I showed, showing the reduction in complexity. So that's a measure of development for that age group, for example. So I think looking week by week at measures that capture the change as the infant develops are really important, but also we need to keep in mind methodological constraints. So for example, with neuroimaging, it's not possible to scan the infant. So even that is a constraint, because what I showed is looking at cross-sectional data. So those different infants at different age, you know, it's not the same infant going across from 32 to 37. So it's really important that, you know, we have more research with potentially less costly, less invasive measures that will enable that kind of higher granularity of information. But I agree, there's a lot going on in that time period that is exciting to understand more how infants develop week by week, even at that period.
Wonderful talk. I'm Thomas from UVM. I have a technical question about the use of fMRI. Since it relies on BOLD and vasculature, do we know whether infants have, like, their vasculature is still developing the same way their nervous system is? Do their BOLD responses and HRFs match what we see in adults? Like, is the comparison biologically valid?
It is, particularly the age group that I'm looking at. So after 32 weeks onwards, there are ways to model slight differences in the hemodynamic response. And some studies have been done, and not huge amounts of differences have been found. There are things that we need to consider methodologically when comparing infants to adults, and that was one of the worries that I had when I started to engage in this research. So some of the comparisons that I've presented here, the data has been normalized at the individual level so as to take into account the huge difference in force or magnitude of activation that can exist between infants and adults that can otherwise contaminate results. So there are ways to control for big differences in the capacity of the brain to respond because of the vasculature development and so on. But I think we've done the best that we can, and we haven't found any real weird, atypical results that would suggest that really we need to look at the infant brain in a completely different way from the assumptions that we made for the adult brain.
Hi, Sid Quitter. I had two questions in one, actually. One is, what do you make of the fact that complexity can sometimes be observed at a lower level, much lower level, say in sleep, for instance? And how do you draw the inference that actually increased entropy, have you shown, is actually going to be some form of evidence for the long-term hypothesis? It was for the long-term hypothesis, for Gopnik's hypothesis. So because there's more entropy, more chaos, and it doesn't mean basically that. Yeah. So I'm trying to understand this one, and the other one is still about complexity. What do you make of the fact that at least during light sleep, there's been evidence that complexity also can be observed, and yeah.
Yes, so I suppose I'll give you a relatively simplistic answer. So with regards to making an interpretation of what an overentropic state in full-term born infants might be, the reference to the lantern proposal really is basically a way of understanding what higher entropic than adult's brain might be, and that the fact that the lantern hypothesis suggests that infants are in a more exploratory state, that they are able to cast to represent the world in a more diffuse way that is able to explore a wider part of the world and of the environment than the more focused attention of the adults. So I think it is very much at a conceptual level that it needs work, but it is a broad analogy that perhaps the overentropy seen in the full-term born infant that is otherwise healthy and shows other markers of consciousness that in a cluster-based approach gives us confidence that really there is capacity there that is potentially that might be the functional relevance of having those more flexible and rapidly changing representations. But I fully agree that the story of complexity is a complex one, and also it kind of varies in terms of when you're looking at measures with EEG and sleep states, there's a lot of depth there and inconsistency. And the studies that I've made use of here and that I'm referring to are looking at it in the fMRI. So there's a lot of methodological development, but also inconsistency, I think, that I'm personally trying to understand in the infant groups. But I think we need to try and simplify and create boundary conditions as much as possible to try and make small steps forward. I think that's...
Thank you very much for the great talk. So I was wondering, so since the HCP data set, the babies, the newborns were mostly asleep. So do you expect the results to change? Like, for example, these functional networks to change if these babies, newborns, sorry, were awake?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. The functional networks are a very robust finding, and that is what really led me to this idea of a capacity that functional organization of the brain is very robustly observed in sleep. And if nothing else, it is sort of, some researchers would say it is a functional manifestation of the structural constraints. So it's a very robust behavior of the healthy brain that in tasks and in awake behavior shows a more distinct utilization and a slightly more disparate behaviors across the networks, but the overall behavior is there. And so for all of the markers that I have used here, they have also been observed in sleep as they have been observed overall in sleep as in awake behavior. But of course, awake utilization is what we want to look at, because that's where we start to experience things more vividly and in a more conscious way, you'd suppose. So was the last question?
Yes, that was an absolutely wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I have a positive suggestion and a challenge to, I think, some of your assumptions from the behavioral data on neonates. So there is evidence for incredibly rich and integrated Yeah, there's evidence for very rich and integrated systems of I don't know whether they're conscious, that's the question. But so for example, we know that there's an innate representation of faces that supports neonatal imitation. So and this is true in monkeys and chimpanzees as well as babies. It's a fragile phenomenon, but I think it's a real one. So if you're looking at a neonate and you do this, the baby does, or you do this, they stick their tongue out. When you stick your tongue out, they open their mouth and they purse their lips if you purse their lips. So think about the focused attention to represent that in the face that you're looking at, and the fact that you have a mapping between what you're seeing and your own face. I mean, that's an amazing piece of organized behavior. And another example is that babies, neonates, are aware when a person is trying to communicate with them. And the evidence for that is that there are cues to communication, like direct matching of eyes, raising your eyebrows, and speaking in motherese. If and only if those things are present, then if the person that's looking at the baby shifts their eye gaze, the baby follows the eye gaze. All right. So this is highly focused and integrated. And the methods, and I can give you 100 other examples. The methods for studying them are essentially just measures of eye gaze and pupil dilation and things like that. They're measures that are available that could be done in maybe imaging studies.
Thank you. That's really, really a nice suggestion. Appreciate that. Thank you.